1939, Matthew Stirling had just arrived in Veracruz, Mexico for a new season of excavations at the site of Tres Zapotes. Stirling was searching for answers about a relatively recently identified civilization in Mexico, the Olmec. Tres Zapotes had already been identified as an Olmec site, but at the time, not much was known about Olmec civilization. There was only a delicate consensus about who the Olmec were. Most scholars assumed that this civilization was a fairly recent player in Mesoamerican history, and that they would have been contemporary with the classical Maya in the second half of the first millennium CE. It wasn't an unreasonable conclusion at the time. Remember, this was before carbon dating was being used in archaeology, and back then the best way to date Mesoamerican civilizations was by stratigraphy, or even better, by cataloging the dates on their monument inscriptions. Stirling, however, suspected that this civilization was much older. Unfortunately for Stirling, he had no hard proof to back up his theories. That is until one day when he chanced upon an incredible discovery, a broken Olmec stela with a partial date inscription. Although the second half of the date inscription was missing, he and his wife Marion deduced that the date on the stela was September 3rd, 32 BCE, by far the oldest written date ever recorded in Mesoamerica. When this was published, it was hailed as a great... Oh wait, actually, no. It was immediately derided by their colleagues as the incredulous result of overenthusiastic speculation. Everyone insisted that the Olmec civilization could not have been that old. Bummer. But not for long. As luck would have it, the Stirlings would be vindicated in the ensuing decades by carbon dating and later by the discovery of the rest of the stela by a local farmer, which allowed archaeologists to verify the Stirlings' proposed date. They had been right all along. This discovery stunned the academic world. It proved the true antiquity of the Olmec and showed that they were the first major civilization in Mesoamerica. Last episode, we examined the Norte Chico, one of the first civilizations of the Americas. In it, we discussed how the Peruvian coast was a cradle of American civilization, and how those pre-ceramic civilizations laid important foundations for later Andean cultures. But Peru was not the only cradle in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, there was another one, on the Mexican coast. So just like we did in our last episode, let's examine the origins of Mesoamerican civilization by exploring its first great civilization, the Olmec. Many aspects of Mesoamerican culture, such as calendars, ball games, and the Mesoamerican pantheon, can be traced back to Olmec influences. And these influences were tremendous. Before we can discuss the Maya, the Zapotec, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs, we need to examine the Olmec and their contributions to Mesoamerican civilization. Unfortunately, the Olmec left us no discernible written histories, nor any oral traditions. All that is known about the Olmec comes to us from archaeology or from the study of subsequent cultures. As much as we know about the Olmec, we are clueless about some basic facts, like the language they spoke or what they called themselves. In fact, the name Olmec comes from the word Olmen, a Nahuatl word meaning rubber people. Rubber was produced by the region's inhabitants as far back as Olmec times all the way until European contact, hence the name. Just keep in mind that Olmec is the name retroactively applied to them by modern scholars. It's not a name that they would have used themselves. Before Olmec civilization arose, the people of Mesoamerica had only recently begun living a sedentary lifestyle. What made this shift possible was the domestication of crops like gourds, squash, beans, avocados, and chilies, but above all, corn, or as we ought to refer to it, maize. Maize was first domesticated in Mexico between 7000 BCE and 6500 BCE, and it would change everything as it was cultivated more and more intensively. So important was maize to the Mesoamericans that most cultures had a maize deity in some form. On an interesting side note, maize was originally domesticated from the teosinte plant. It's a testament to their agricultural prowess that this tiny grass was fashioned into one of the most important staple crops in the world. I mean, just look how tiny those cobs are. If you aren't very impressed by maize, I'd also like to point out that the Olmec were the first civilization to have chocolate. So let's take a moment to thank the Olmecs for helping bestow chocolate on this cruel world, and then let's get back to our topic. By the beginning of the second millennium BCE, civilization was beginning to take shape. What's fascinating about the development of Mesoamerican civilization is that it occurred very late compared to other early civilizations. But when it did, it blossomed with astonishing speed. Archaeologist Brian Fagan sums this up excellently.
A vast chasm separates the thousands of farming villages scattered throughout Central America in 2000 BC and the sophisticated civilizations that arose with dramatic suddenness only 1,500 years later.
Nothing epitomizes that drastic change better than the rise of the Olmec. For over 1,000 years from 1700 BCE to the end of the first millennium BCE, the Olmec were a cultural juggernaut in Mesoamerica. Despite being largely confined to the Mexican Gulf Coast in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, the Olmec exercised an oversized influence over Central America. Unlike their contemporaries, the Olmec were living in large, planned urban settlements with elite residences, workshops, and rich, elaborate tombs. The best known of these sites is the city of Venta, which thrived from 900 BCE to 400 BCE. Venta has a planned layout with many temple mounds surrounding a main plaza. The main feature of the site is its Great Pyramid. It's been badly eroded in the millennia since its construction, but surveys and excavations show that it was a large rectangular pyramid with stepped sides, much like later pyramids in Mesoamerica. These are all features that we're going to see later in Mesoamerican cities. This wasn't just a city of corn farmers, although there were a lot of those. It was an economic and cultural hub, home to merchants, artists, sculptors, priests, and a ruling elite. Venta is not an isolated example. Other Olmec cities have their own monuments. The fact that the Olmec elite could commission such huge public works speaks to the sophistication of Olmec society. But what exactly were they commissioning? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at Olmec art to find out. Nothing highlights the Olmec better than their distinctive and recognizable art. Their most iconic and well-known works are by far their colossal heads. Even if you've never studied the Olmec, you've probably seen pictures of them in a textbook or on TV. These heads are gigantic. Each one is carved from a huge block of basalt. The nearest source of this is all the way in the Tuxtla Mountains, which means that they had to not only be carved, but moved huge distances. Remember, there are no draft animals in Mesoamerica. You can't just strap some oxen and mules to those boulders and tell them to move. They could only be moved by human labor. The organization and effort to move these from quarries to the cities and ceremonial centers must have been enormous. As far as we know, they could have been dragged overland or perhaps transported on balsa rafts via the local rivers, but no one is certain. But what are these sculptures exactly? Most scholars agree that these heads represent Olmec rulers, as each one is distinct and no two portray the same person. Each head has a helmet or headgear. The heads are very recognizable for their realism and their broad facial features, like their flat noses and full lips. These striking features have actually caused some to theorize that the heads are sculptures of Africans, but these theories are rejected by Mesoamerican scholars, and I'll have more to say about these views later. In total, there are 17 heads that have been discovered at various Olmec sites. These range in size from just under 5 feet to 11 feet tall. The largest head is over 25 tons. To put that in perspective, that's more than the weight of 2 school buses. One interesting thing I discovered while making this episode is that there are actually several replica Olmec heads across the United States. If you ever pay a visit to the Field Museum in Chicago, City College of San Francisco, Lehman College at the City of New York, the Smithsonian, or the University of Texas in Austin, you can see one of these replicas. Pretty cool. As impressive as the Olmec heads are, they were not the only colossal sculpture crafted by the Olmec. They also carved massive stone altars, each from a single block of basalt weighing over 40 tons. Actually, the term altar is a bit of a misnomer. When these were first excavated, they were believed to be altars, but experts are pretty certain that these huge blocks were actually thrones for rulers. The reason for this is that there's actually images and sculptures of rulers sitting on these altars. Each throne contains a niche with a man sitting in a cave, either holding a baby with jaguar features or a rope, sometimes both. In many later Mesoamerican cultures, caves are an entrance to the supernatural world, so this imagery is very evocative. Remember this, because caves are going to come up later in the episode. As these monuments show, the Olmec were masters at shaping stone, and these monuments are only the tip of the iceberg. One of the finest examples of Olmec sculpture is the wrestler. This seated figure is portrayed in a realistic and dynamic way that is seldom seen in Mesoamerica. Another important piece comes from a burial in Venta. This group of small jade figurines were found posed around a central figure in a very striking scene. No one is certain what this is depicting, but it definitely fires up the imagination. Is this a scene from Olmec mythology, a ruler's court, or a scene from the deceased's life? We don't know, but it is pretty cool to think about. Olmec art is one of the best tools we have in reconstructing their religion and their beliefs. When we examine Olmec art with a knowledge of later cultures, we can see important religious concepts taking shape. Remember those babies from the thrones we just talked about? Let's take a closer look at those. Babies abound in Olmec art, usually on the chubby side. Many of these babies, just as the ones on the thrones, have jaguar features. This is a very common theme in Olmec art, and scholars call these babies were-jaguars, like werewolves, but instead a were-jaguar. These depict people that are in the process of transforming into jaguars. They have snarling, fanged mouths, upturned lips, and sometimes even claws. These images are not just limited to children. There are also examples of adult transformations, as well as transformations into other animals like birds, sharks, and crocodiles, but were-jaguars are the most common. They appear in ritual axes carved from greenstone and other materials. Were-jaguars occupied an important place in Olmec religion, and it's believed that some of these were-jaguars are shamans in a state of transformation. Shamanism was an important element in Olmec and later Mesoamerican religions. They are not unique to Mesoamerican culture. You can find shamans in many parts of the world, even today. Shamans interact with the spiritual world by taking hallucinogens to enter an altered state of consciousness. In this state, Olmec shamans could transform into animal spirits and enter the supernatural world, and through it influence the real world. A shaman might want to influence the growth of crops or the coming of rain to sustain his people. Shamans were very important people in the Olmec community, and it's no wonder that we find so much representation of them in their art. However, some of these were-jaguars also show us a picture of proto-deities that will appear in later Mesoamerican religions. One piece that exemplifies this is the Lalimas figure. The sculpture is of a man holding yet another were-jaguar baby, but what makes it significant are the inscriptions carved into the man's body. It's very hard to see in this picture, but there are 4 icons carved into his shoulders and knees. Scholars have pointed out that these icons have distinct features later associated with Mesoamerican deities. These features are very diagnostic, and we can use them to identify specific later deities. For example, on his right shoulder, we have Xipe Totec, the god of spring and regeneration. He's also known as the flayed god. On the left, we have what is believed to be the fire god, or the fire serpent as he's also known. On the left knee, we have the god of death. On the right knee is the feathered serpent, known more commonly by its Aztec name, Quetzalcoatl, and by the Maya as Coculcan. He's going to be a big figure in later Mesoamerican religion. The cradled infant has been identified as the Maize god due to the decorated band above his head. Here's another image of a were-jaguar Maize god. These are some of the earliest images we have of the Mesoamerican pantheon. These show that important deities had their origin among the Olmec, but gods aren't the only elements of Mesoamerican mythology depicted in Olmec art. At the Olmec site of El Azuzul, archaeologists unearthed 2 statues of identical twins. For anyone familiar with the Maya creation story, the Popol Vuh, these identical twins should be ringing a bell. These are believed to be the hero twins from the story. Twins feature very prominently in the heroic literature and art of Mesoamerica, but this is one of the earliest examples we have of a depiction of twins. Again, when we talk about Mesoamerican mythology in later episodes, think back to the Olmec and think back to this sculpture. One final religious practice that appears to have its origin in Olmec culture is bloodletting. An intact tomb at Venta contains a stingray spine and other instruments that many scholars believe were used to draw blood. Bloodletting, or auto-sacrifice as it's also called, played an important role in later Mesoamerican religions. By offering up their blood, rulers and priests could ritually contact their revered ancestors and ask for their intercession in the spiritual world. This was a vital element of kingship during the later classical period, and we're going to see it come up again. Religion and art were not the only legacy of Olmec culture. Perhaps one of the greatest Olmec achievements was their use of the Mesoamerican calendar and the long count. There's a lot of debate over the exact source of the Mesoamerican calendar, but the Olmec played a huge role in spreading it across Mesoamerica. If you want to learn more about the calendar and its significance, you're in luck because we've already covered that in a previous episode. But I'll just hit the highlights here. The calendar was a universal feature of nearly all Mesoamerican cultures, and it underpinned all ceremonial and religious life. We see this calendar used by the Maya, the Mixtec, the Aztecs, the Zapotecs, and others. To say it was widespread and successful is an understatement. Not only that, the Olmec also had a written numerical system with which they could write dates. We open this episode with one such example. This allowed the Olmecs to do something no one else could do, to record their history in writing. Now, the ability to write numbers poses another important question. Usually when counting is being recorded, writing usually follows. Did the Olmecs follow this progression to writing and spread it to other areas of Mesoamerica? That's a question fraught with a lot of debate. You see, writing pops up in the late formative period in multiple places, the Olmec heartland, the Valley of Oaxaca, and the Maya highlands. But a common ancestor of these scripts is elusive, and there's very little consensus over who came first, who influenced the other. It's very much open for debate. During this time, Olmec writing was abundant. The Epi-Olmec were writing elaborate monumental inscriptions. The best example is the La Mojara stela from the Tres Zapotes area. This enormous basalt stela shows a figure, most likely a ruler, next to a lengthy inscription. We can tell from the date inscription on the stela that it's from the end of the late formative period. Unfortunately, the script remains undeciphered, and all attempts to decipher it have been unsuccessful. But as cool as that is, we need to dig deeper to find the earliest Olmec writing. If you want to go back as far as possible to witness the purported origins of writing, you'll arrive at the El Cascajal block that was found near the Olmec city of San Lorenzo. It features several rows of hieroglyphs, although the nature of these glyphs is disputed by some scholars. This block dates from about 1000 to 900 BCE, but the hieroglyphs do not resemble any other Mesoamerican script. Could this be a proto-script? Or possibly a dead end? It's hard to say. But the most compelling artifacts come later from the Venta area. The first we will examine is a cylinder seal found in 2002 that dates to approximately 650 BCE. What makes this seal so interesting is that it contains a bird with a speech scroll coming from its mouth that ends in 2 hieroglyphs, just like a character in a comic strip. These 2 hieroglyphs are similar to those of later Mayan and Isthmian writing. Greenstone fragments from the site show glyphs with similarities to other scripts as well. An Olmec statue found in La Blanca on the Pacific coast, far away from the Olmec heartland, shows similar hieroglyphs as well. With this in mind, some scholars believe that there's an argument to be made that writing first originated in the Olmec heartland and then was dispersed throughout Mesoamerica. It should be noted, once again, that these claims are a bit controversial and the matter is not settled. Any day now, a new discovery could easily change how we see the origins of Mesoamerican writing. What is clear is that the Olmec were early adopters of writing and helped spread literacy throughout Central America. Another cultural legacy of the Olmec is the Mesoamerican ball game. The ball game was a huge fixture in Mesoamerica. Ball courts were a regular feature in urban design all over Mesoamerica and even beyond. If you've ever seen the ruins of a Mesoamerican city, you've probably seen the remains of a ball court. They're very distinct with their eye shape, their walls, and the alleyway between them. This picture here comes from the ball court at the Zapotec capital of Monte Alban. The ball game was not just a sport to pass the time, it was an important religious ritual that recreated mythology and brought communities together. A ball game symbolized the battle between good and evil and life and death, and usually culminated in the sacrifice of the losing captain, or maybe even the losing team. Like the calendar, it's possible that the ball game may have origins outside the Olmec heartland. No Olmec site has ever yielded a ball court. The oldest known ball court actually comes from the distant Soconusco region. However, at the Olmec site of Elmanity, rubber balls have been found dating back to 1500 BC, and these are the earliest ever found. These solid rubber balls were made by tapping rubber trees and fashioning the rubber into balls for the game. This is good evidence that the game was being played by the Olmec from a very early time, even if they weren't incorporating formal ball courts into their urban architecture. Or perhaps they were, and archaeology has yet to find them. Either way, the Olmec were among the earliest cultures playing the ball game in Mesoamerica. So how do we know that these ideas were spread so thoroughly throughout Mesoamerica? You might think it's because we see so many firsts among the Olmec, but the real reason is much more interesting. It's because Olmec artifacts and sites can be found all over Mesoamerica. The Olmec were not isolationists. They expanded and traded with their contemporaries all across Central America. The Olmecs were producing rubber, cacao, salt, and manufactured goods like fine pottery. The items they appeared to be trading for were jade and serpentine for crafting, obsidian for weapons and tools, and iron ore for mirrors. And this contact wasn't incidental. There's a lot of evidence for intense Olmec contact outside the heartland. A great example of this is the site of Chalcatzinco in the Valley of Morelos. That sheer mountain you see in the picture has long been considered sacred by indigenous peoples, and the Olmec may have considered this a sacred site as well. Between 700 and 500 BCE, the Olmec had a strong presence there and left spectacular bas-relief carvings into the rock cliffs. The location of Chalcatzingo also lies about halfway between the heartland and the mountain sources of obsidian. It would have behooved the Olmec to ensure that Chalcatzingo was on friendly terms. Another site, Teopantecuanitlan, all the way in the modern state of Guerrero, has a ceremonial sunken court flanked with an Olmec-style were-jaguar depiction of the Maize god. Guerrero was an important trading partner with the Olmec because it was a source of high-quality jade, so Olmec presence here shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Elsewhere in Guerrero, the Juxtlahuaca cave features an extraordinary cave painting of a figure holding a captive bound by a rope. Other nearby caves show jaguars and even the feathered serpent. Remember the thrones we discussed earlier, replete with cave imagery? These caves likely held a spiritual significance, and the art there is not a coincidence. Other Olmec or Olmec-influenced sites can be found in Chiapas, the southern Guatemalan coast, and even as far as El Salvador. Now all this begs the question, what was the nature of this contact? Are these sites evidence of a peaceful trading network or a violent intrada? There's no doubt that the Olmec had a warrior tradition. Violence pops up in Olmec art several times. But Olmec artifacts could just as easily be the result of trade items brought back from the Olmec heartland. Nobody really knows, but there's a lot of debate on the topic, and the real answer could easily be a combination of both. What's important about this, and what I want you to take away from it, is the sheer extent of Olmec contact within Mesoamerica. With this contact came the cultural and religious trappings that we've been discussing. Dr. Michael Coe summarizes this very well.
Where they did not go, or where their influence was unfelt, civilized life never took hold, not even in the 2.5 millennia that elapsed between them and the Spanish conquest. Beyond the frontier of the Olmec realm were the barbarians, the people without calendar, writing, and science, without great art, without states and civilized centers.
Now, before we wrap up this video, we need to discuss one last thing that everybody loves: conspiracy theories. As Mesoamerica's oldest civilization, the Olmec are at the center of many colorful, shall we say, alternate theories. There are scholars who have suggested that Olmec achievements in art were the result of an outside influence, most commonly from Africa, but you can also read about influences from China and Europe as well. Some people, most prominently among them Ivan van Sertima, have suggested that the Olmec colossal heads have African ethnic characteristics, specifically those broad noses and full lips, and thus it's proof of an ancient African contact with Mesoamerica. Among the many other points are that Mesoamerican pyramids are derived from the pyramids of Egypt and Nubia. I've read several of these, and I can assure you that they are painful to read. All Mesoamerican scholars that I've read agree that there is no substantiating evidence to these claims. Experts point out that these African features on the colossal heads are also shared by the indigenous people of the Veracruz region. They also point out that Mesoamerican pyramids have a well-documented evolution in history, one that is very distinct from the pyramids of Egypt. I also have not seen a shred of genetic or linguistic evidence to back these theories. On a lighter note, I would also like to add a personal observation that if any African or Asian civilization made contact with the Olmec, how on earth did they arrive in the only chocolate-producing region of the world and not bring chocolate back to the old world? Talk about a miss. But back to business. This kind of speculation is part of a much larger trend. There are lots of other conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific literature that'll tell you that some Native American achievement was the result of European, African, or Asian influence. These claims are, at best, the result of poor research and hurried speculation, and at worst, deliberate attempts to usurp Native American achievement. Such theories have very little merit and should not be taken seriously. Arguing that Old World inhabitants may have washed up in America or may have had a single episode of contact is one thing, but arguing that there was a sustained transoceanic contact with the Olmec or any other American civilization is baseless speculation. Fringe theories aside, the Olmec were an extremely successful civilization and left a huge impression on Mesoamerica. Olmec-style art can be found everywhere. Not only was it prolific, it was extremely long-lived. Olmec culture lasted over 1,000 years, but began to finally decline with the abandonment of Venta in 400 BCE. Some later Olmec sites, most notably Tres Zapotes, soldiered on for a few more centuries before Olmec culture slowly faded away, replaced by newer civilizations who were now heirs to a towering legacy. I hope I've made it clear just how pivotal the Olmec were in spreading the use of the Mesoamerican calendar, religion, the ball game, and urban design. As the Olmec went, so did most of Mesoamerica. When we cover later topics in Mesoamerica, you'll hear the Olmecs popping up again and again, and you'll get a real appreciation for their legacy. And with that, I hope you've appreciated this episode on what many consider to be the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Ancient American content. See you later.